Last chapter found a real gravitational well in this substrate. Not a mirage, a genuine potential that does mechanical work on matter. Which means somebody is going to ask the obvious next question, and we may as well ask it first. Can I turn the knob? Can I make the well deeper here and shallower there, on demand, without rebuilding the lattice? And behind that question is a much greedier one. Can I do it for free? Because a well I can paint without paying for it, or better, a well of negative depth, is not an engineering curiosity. That is a warp drive. Space-time as propellant. So today we run that ambition all the way to ground, and the verdict comes in two halves. The knob is real. It exists, it is a single dial, and it sweeps further than you would expect. The free lunch does not exist, and the reason it does not is the first axiom of the whole theory. One thing before we begin. Advaita Chakra Theory is a speculative, exploratory framework, not established, peer-reviewed physics. Much of what follows is honest conjecture that still needs validation. Watch it in that spirit as ideas to test, argue with, and refute. Here is the setup. Chapter 10's lapse is static, fix the medium's locking, and its inertia. And the well is whatever it is. To actuate it, we need a handle that changes the effective locking without touching the hardware. And there is exactly one such handle. Time. Take a single rotor pinned by the on-site locking of axiom 4. The rotor is pinned to a reference phase, call it the shaft. Now shake the shaft, not the rotor, the shaft to drive the reference phase harmonically at a frequency far above the mode's own gap. The rotor cannot follow the shaking, it is too slow, so what it feels instead is an average, and the average of a shaken potential is not the potential you started with. This is the Kapitza trick, the vibrating pendulum that stands up inverted. What is different here is where the shaking goes, not into the pivot's position, but into the argument of the locking itself. What that buys and what it costs is the whole chapter. Now do the averaging properly. Split the motion into a slow part and a fast ripple, freeze the slow part, and average the force over one drive cycle. Only one average is non-trivial, the average of the cosine of a cosine omega t. And that is a textbook identity, Jacobi anger, and it returns J0 of the zeroth Bessel function of the drive amplitude. So the slow variable obeys an ordinary pendulum equation again, but with the locking multiplied by J0. That is the actuator, and it is a one-liner. The effective locking becomes K times J0 of A. The gap squared becomes Kj0 over the inertia. And because chapter 10 told us the lapse is 1/2 the change in the log of locking over inertia, and the drive moves the locking while leaving the inertia completely alone, the lapse is 1/2 the log of J0 of A. That is derived, and it is the row the honesty ledger calls R9. Be clear about what is new and what is not is not. The averaging is standard Kapitza physics, 100 years old, and we flag it as standard. What is new is the target. Nobody had pointed it at the lapse, because until last chapter the corpus had no lapse to point it at. Now look at what that single dial actually sweeps, because J0 is a more interesting function than a knob has any right to be. It starts at 1, falls, crosses 0, and goes negative. So turn the dial slowly. At a equals 0, J0 is 1 full locking, the undriven ground state, the well is flat. Between 0 and 2.4 arrow 5, J0 falls, the gap shrinks, and the lapse well deepens, and matter's effective mass falls with it as the square root of J0. Then, at a equals 2.405, the first root of the Bessel function, J0 is exactly 0. The gap closes. The mode goes massless on demand. That is dynamical unlocking. For a moment the pseudo-goldstone recovers the exact flat direction that chapters 2 and 3 started from. And past the root, J0 goes negative and the locking flips sign. The point the rotor was pinned to becomes unstable, and the anti-phase point becomes the stable one, the Kapitza inverted state, the pendulum standing on its head. 1 dial, 3 regimes, all the way through sign reversal. Gate C of the propulsion audit said there is no known actuator for the lapse. There is one now. An actuator that costs nothing would be extraordinary. It would let you paint a gravitational potential for free, and a deep enough negative region would be a well of exotic sign, precisely the ingredient every warp metric needs. So we account for the energy honestly, and this is where the chapter earns its keep. Compute the cycle-averaged mechanical energy of the driven state. To leading order, it is minus k J0 of A, plus a vibrational term that falls off as 1 over omega squared, the residual jitter of the fast ripple, which vanishes in the high-frequency limit we are working in. Now compare that against the undriven ground state, which sits at minus k. The difference is the energy the drive deposits, k times 1 minus J0 of A. And here is the whole result in one inequality. J0 is never greater than 1. So that deposit is never negative, not for any amplitude, anywhere on the dial. The averaged energy has a hard floor at the undriven ground state, and even in the inverted regime, where J0 is negative and the state has flipped over, the energy has gone up, not down. There is no negative energy here. Gate D, the exotic energy gate, is not breached, so the deposit is positive. But there is a sharper question: is the lapse a free channel that happens to cost something, or is it energy sourced bought at a rate? Expand at small drive. J0 is approximately 1 minus s squared over 4, so the lapse is about minus s squared over 8, and the deposited energy is about Ka squared over 4. Both go as a squared. So eliminate a squared between them, and the amplitude drops out entirely, leaving the verdict: the lapse is minus the deposited energy density over twice the locking. That is the signature of ordinary energy-sourced gravity. You dig the well by putting energy in, and the depth is set by how much you put in. Numerically, the ratio runs 1.01, 1.03, 1.06, 1.14 as the drive climbs unity at small amplitude, with a log correction growing as the gap softens. Take the worked example: a medium normalized so the locking and the inertia are both 1, driven at omega equals 40. Turn the knob to A equals 2. J0 is 0.224. The gap drops to 0.473, less than half its undriven value, and the effective mass drops by the same factor. The lapse is minus 0.748, and the bill is 0.776 per site. Deep well, fully paid. Now, why must this be so? Because the substrate is reversible, axiom A1. A time-reversible flow has no ratchet. There is nothing in it that can extract net energy from a periodic drive. The no-free lunch result is not an accident of this calculation, it is reversibility, showing up as an accounting rule. There is, however, a real lever here, and it is the only thing in part 3 that pushes back against the scale wall. Look at the efficiency, lapse per unit energy deposited, as you drive to the Bessel route. The lapse is 1/2 the log of J0, and as J0 goes to 0, that logarithm runs to minus infinity. But the energy deposit does not run anywhere. It saturates at K. So a finite energy budget, at most the locking energy per site, buys an arbitrarily deep well. Push the worked example from A equals 2 to A equals 2.40. J0 falls to 0.025, the lapse goes to minus 2.99 A to 4 times deeper, and the bill is 0.998, essentially unchanged. Efficiency 3 up from 0.96, and here is why that matters. The coupling setting this efficiency is 1 over K, the inverse of the medium's locking energy. It is not the Planck-suppressed coupling that walls off static-induced gravity back in Chapter 8. This channel sidesteps that suppression entirely. Now the two caveats, and they are both in the source. The divergence is only logarithmic, so to gain a factor of 10 you must approach the root exponentially closely. The lever is real but weak, and the approach to masslessness invalidates the very tools that derived it. The slowly varying potential picture of Chapter 10 breaks down at criticality. The enhancement is self-limiting. It softens the scale wall. It does not break it. So grant everything. You have an actuatable lapse. Drive it harder ahead than behind, so the well is deeper forward than aft. The payload is pulled toward the deeper well. Have you built a drive? No, and the reason is embarrassingly simple. The reaction lands on the drive apparatus, and the drive apparatus is riding in the same vehicle. This is the bootstrap. You cannot lift yourself by pulling on a well you are carrying. Net thrust requires momentum carried away, and the only reservoir on offer is the substrate itself. Spacetime as propellant. That is a coherent idea, and it is exotic, and it works only if ordinary matter can dump momentum into the fundamental substrate at some rate. Local momentum conservation tests bound that rate very tightly. Part 7 turns it into a number, and the number is 10 to the minus 12. So gate D stands. What has been built here is a local potential landscape you can paint. An artificial gravity element for the medium zone excitations, not a warp drive for a vehicle. And that distinction is the honest boundary of the entire propulsion thread. Verdict: the actuator exists. A single dimensionless dial, through a Bessel function, moves the effective locking, the gap, and the lapse across locking, unlocking, and inversion. That answers gate C, which had stood on the claim that no mechanism was known. The actuator is energy paid, the deposit is non-negative for every drive amplitude, and the lapse is proportional to it. So gate D is not breached, and the reason is reversibility rather than a numerical accident. The one genuine prize is the near-critical amplifier, whose coupling is the inverse locking energy rather than the Planck-suppressed one, and it is logarithmic and self-limiting, so it softens the scale wall without breaking it. Now, what is not claimed? The energy deposit here is the mechanical energy of one rotor and its shaft. The full field theoretic stress tensor across a coupled lattice has not been computed. The sign should survive, because J0 never exceeds 1, and that is exact, but the magnitude and any spatial structure are open. And the whole construction is about writing a lapse into an engineered medium. It makes no claim that the cosmic substrate is reachable. Next, the gravity arc gets its summing up. What kind of gravitational theory has this substrate actually produced? And the answer is more specific and more limiting than the arc so far has let on. A word of acknowledgement. This work was inspired in part by the non-dual teachings of Sri Narayana Guru, that the creator, the creation, and the substance of creation are fundamentally one. Symbols from the Hindu tradition, the Sudarshan chakra and the Shiva linga, suggested the analogies behind the chakra model. They are acknowledged as philosophical and symbolic inspiration. The physics stands on its own. Thank you for watching. If this made you think, the book and the next chapter are linked below. Until then, one substance and how far it reaches.